you're doing that, and then what happens next?
Well, I sort of run into Orthodoxy while I'm in college.
Hmm.
One of my friends from high school, he was like a year older than me. And we ended up going to the same college. His dad was the library director for the college that we went to. And so I got to know him, and he was such a really unique kind of guy. He was really into karate and wrote a lot of poetry, and he had converted to Orthodoxy. So he is like his whole story real quick was he grew up sort of like nominal Roman Catholic, was beat up in school in Brooklyn. He grew up in Brooklyn, and then learned karate to sort of self-defense, got into the spiritual side of karate, and then got really serious and into practices like in his early adulthood, like like tantric stuff and
Yeah.
everything like that. Had an
Yeah.
encounter with some sort of like evil spirit that was really profound for him, and he was like,
Yeah.
"Oh my word, there's like personal evil, so there must be personal good." And so he went through all this process, became evangelical for a short while, and then eventually became Orthodox. And so I knew him, and I was like, man, this is a story I've never heard, right?
Yeah.
A small town evangelical world. This was like a very different world and story. And I developed a relationship with him, uh, like a mentoring relationship,
Hmm.
right? Because I was kind of looking for that. I would say that I was looking for more depth, like more of a spirituality that was more than just the typical evangelical read your Bible and pray
Hmm.
kind of thing,
Hmm.
right? And so I was looking for deeper wells, and I think that was part of developing that relationship with him was
Mm.
that sort of craving for that,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I mean, I don't know for sure, but I kind of think me finding orthodoxy when I did in college might have staved off some spiritual or faith crises that would have been coming over the horizon for me, like after college or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
I'm intellectual enough and questioning enough, and I'm really high in openness
Yeah.
that I feel like I would have started to have some like problems I would have started wrestling with more, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I had a little bit, not terrible, but a little bit of a hard time at the beginning with the liturgical type worship. That's not why I went there
Mm.
initially. In some ways, I was just like, well, I'll just learn to like it, or I'll learn to understand it, and I'll just, so I sort of just stuck with it in that way. I mean, and now, like, almost 20 years down the road, that stuff like the ritual gets in your bones in a way that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
like really profound.
Yeah.
And it's nice to have, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think like American culture is very ritually illiterate, right? Like
Oh,
just,
yes.
and then when you sort of have deep ritual in your life, man, you're really grateful for it. You're like, this
Mm.
is really necessary as a human being to have
Mm.
rituals that stretch across generations and like centuries.
Hmm.
So I learned to like that. But like what attracted to me, one, I mean, initially it was just I was looking for greater spiritual depth. And the spirituality in Orthodoxy is, it's like the Marianas Trench, like you can go as deep as you want,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So there was that. The other one was some church history, right? Like learning, I mean, you grow up in this sort of evangelical church history, and then you sort of learn the whole story, and you sort of feel like, especially if you're younger like that, feel like, man, did someone pull the wool over my eyes? I feel like maybe I was not told the whole story. And so then you get curious, right? Um, and so I think the history, and then the other thing that really did it for me was really the theology being so rich and beautiful
Mm.
and not being compartmentalized,
Mm.
right? In the way I experienced learning it in the Protestant world, it was just like there was such a continuity between different areas of theology and between the theology and practice that
Hmm.
was really, I just thought, beautiful and just seemed really right. And in particular was like the doctrines of like salvation, like soteriology, so stuff around atonement, right?
Mm.
Because I think this is what makes a lot of people lose faith is they lose faith in atonement.
Hmm.
And by this I mean some version of penal substitutionary atonement of some
Hmm.
variety of that. And people eventually just be like, I can't believe that.
Hmm.
And because that theology is made sort of like, in many cases, almost the totality of the gospel,
Hmm.
if you don't buy that, then you don't buy anything, basically, is the
Hmm.
way it ends up getting framed in people's minds. And
Yeah.
so for me, running into sort of theosis, like deification and the whole
Hmm.
vision of salvation was a relief. And when I first sort of started running into it, I thought, oh, this is what I've always believed
Hmm.
and never could put into words. And I
Hmm.
know a lot of Orthodox people who would say the exact same thing when it comes to theosis. So like
Hmm.
theosis, I think, is a really important aspect for a lot of people who become Orthodox is that vision of salvation is different. It's one that people can get on board with,
Hmm.
in a way, and doesn't paint God in the same troubling picture that it can. It's easier
Hmm.
for people to swallow, and I think it gives people because some of the stuff there's such a distinction between sort of like justification and sanctification, and there's
Hmm.
such a distinction that it's almost like it's hard to like make the connection between them,
Yep. Yep.
and you don't have that problem, right?
Yep.
So I think that's really because people want to be like, okay, here's this story of salvation. Well, how do I mimic it? How do I imitate it? How do I live it out? Right. And
Yep.
if I can't live it out very easily, it's hard to believe things you can't live out.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So I would say that was also a big part of it, you know?
That makes real sense. That makes real sense. I could very much understand that. Just in terms of looking at when people, we use this word deconstruct, which probably isn't the best word, but when people give up the faith, let's say, or renounce the faith or abandon the faith, um, often I can see that even if they can't articulate it, there's, I one of the things that I'm always sort of back and forth with John Vervaeke about is his complete dismissal of two worlds mythology. But I think a lot of that is behind this, where I think part of what happened in the conversations that emerged in the Protestant Reformation was a reduction. I saw this early on years ago, a reduction of the gospel into hell avoidance.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you look at sort of what's happening in the late medieval Roman Catholic Church and in some of those places where the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation does break out, um, it's not hard to understand. Just even looking at, let's say, Martin Luther's life, it's not hard to see how this the the threat of perdition is used as it's basically used as a cudgel
Yeah.
to herd the sheep in so many ways that seem really unintelligible to that particular drama, that at some point people are like, are you really going to tell me that failure to do this will result in eternal damnation? Or
Yeah, people
as,
just stop buying the story. And then when
yeah,
people do give it up, they're like, you know what? I'm just going to try to give it up for a bit and see what happens.
yeah,
And they
yeah,
do, and they have an overwhelming flood of relief,
yes,
a sense of freedom. Like, oh,
yep,
I didn't realize the dark cloud this was putting over my whole life. And so you can very well understand that. Yeah.
yep,
So,
yep,
for example, so like I don't know if I told you this or not, but like I am writing my dissertation right now at Fordham,
yep.
and I'm doing it on atonement and deification, right? So atonement and theosis. So working through all of that. And the very practical concerns are very much the stuff we've already talked about because like I see atonement. I mean, it can mean a lot of different things, but I mean, what it means popular to almost everybody, say in an American context, I would say it's just a bad story, right? And there's a number of ways you can measure that. It's like it lacks some coherence. It doesn't give a robust enough sense of meaning. It doesn't act as a map for people's lives, right? You can go on and on about this. There's questions about like, well, how does it relate to the principal texts of like the atonement, which is like the passion narratives and the Exodus narrative that it's founded on? And it's like seems way out in left field, right? So I'm hoping, I figure, well, the best way to get rid of a bad story is you got to tell a better one, right? And one that actually helps people, sort of like gives them a map to live a life, some sort of map of redemption, and to atone for things in some way. So that's sort of like, so even my dissertation stuff comes out of like my own original concerns and interests in my own conversion, right? So
That makes perfect sense. That makes really good sense. It also makes sense of the, let's see, the emergent movement, which is also happening about the time you go to Orthodoxy. And
yeah, see,
because,
I've heard some of your videos, and I sort of missed a lot of that.
yeah,
I heard about it, but more from sort of like, third person perspective,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So the emergent movement is very much dealing with all those same issues, but I think, I think you were fortunate to sort of have this avenue into orthodoxy that could sort of, I sometimes look at orthodoxy, as you said, it's the Marianas Trench, or I always look at the room of requirement in Harry Potter, where orthodoxy, it's like, you need something theologically? Well, open up that storeroom, because orthodoxy has sort of walked through it all out there, and you can find someone who's dealt with this idea and that idea, and Neoplatonism, they got a whole section on Neoplatonism back there, and just all over the place. And I think um, a lot of what happened with the emergent movement is that they didn't sort of have that storehouse for a lot of people. And so basically they just sort of, as what happened in modernism, they sort of immanentized the eschaton, and just a whole generation of people just walked away from the faith, which again, you get that initial euphoric relief of, well, I'm not running away from the shepherd who's chasing me with the cudgel of eternal conscious torment anymore. And so, wow, all I had to do was just stop going there on Sunday morning and stop hanging out with those kind of people and stop listening to that music and those messages. And now I can just go to Starbucks on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
But then other things are going to come up in life
Yeah,
that a
just
shallow
give that time.
hedonism, especially if you embrace it with sort of a, a a materialist naturalism, I think for a lot of people is eventually going to wind up in some sort of meaning crisis, where
Yeah.
far deeper questions eventually seep up, and they realize that, okay, so no, you're no longer sort of running away from the fear of eternal damnation, but there's a whole lot of other things that practice of religion was actually affording you, in your real life, and even in the secular frame, that you've also given up. And so now, what are you going to do with those things? And
Yeah,
then
it's
people
sort
go
of
off on the
yeah, it's sort of
search.
like the the boost in well-being and happiness that someone can get, like uh for initially, and maybe for quite a long period of time, from like leaving the faith. uh if you don't have enough robust sort of source of meaning, or a meaning framework for that to rest in, it's like the happiness turns to ash in your mouth, and
Mm.
that does eventually happen, to people. I would say, like, you're talking about the whole kludgeon of, like, internal damnation. That is also one of the things that was a real, point of attraction for me, that actually made me believe more, was that Orthodoxy is, I would say, more open and far more accepting of universalism,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we should say there's different types. This is like the
Yep.
patristic sort of
Yep.
apocatasticity, sort of, there's not a hell, right?
Right.
It's just not like unreasonable. Um, and that was like, that made me, like, it's funny, that made me believe more. And that's been my experience with a lot of people who run into it, is they're like, oh, this is like part of a tradition, right? I mean, I would say it's definitely like, um, there's not any sort of official proclamation on something like this, like
Right.
one way or the other. It just sort of
Right.
sits out there in sort of non-dogmatic land.
Yep.
But what I've seen over and over again is when people run into that, it actually increases their faith and obedience and
Mm.
compliance, not the other way around, which is what you kind of, I think, is the fear for a lot of people who are like, well, if people don't go
Yeah.
to hell, then no one's going to act good,
Yeah. Yeah.
and there's a bunch of problems with that. Like, what do you, is it just like for a reward or something? Is that the kind of love? Like, it raises all these problematic questions, but I think at the heart, it's a fear that people aren't going to be held accountable and that people aren't going to believe. And I've seen in some ways actually the opposite, right? That you can actually get a lot better compliance, right? If people have something high they're aiming towards,
Yep. Yep.
not just something low they're running away from.
Yep.
And so some people are sort of like are on a spiritual journey and they're feeling it out. And they like we get a lot of people who come from deep like faith deconstruction places, right? Their
Yep.
faith has been deconstructed. And then orthodoxy is their attempt to sort of maybe like, well, maybe I'll try this weird thing that's totally outside the box as a way to revive it. Or sometimes orthodoxy is the last stop on the train line before they hop off Christianity altogether.
Yeah. Yeah.
And universalism can sometimes be this sort of like one point of many that sort of makes them be like, oh, I can believe that.
Yeah.
And then they're able to get on board with that.
Yeah. Long term, the threat of hell, while in my opinion biblical, um, doesn't function psychologically with our current generations, certainly as the late medievals had and early moderns had hoped it would function in terms of compliance. And that I think people today have a real understanding that obedience, obedience achieved purely on the basis of threat is not the kind of obedience that actually many people appreciate. And
Yeah,
and I think I could
it's just
talk
not
about
it's not as robust, as people would hope or like it to be,
well the minute God's watching eyes are turned, that's always the problem with sort of threat-based compliance is that the moment the threat is gone, so is the compliance. And what you really want to do in formation is, I have adult children. To the degree that my adult children would honor me or even obey me if I asked for it, if the basis of that obedience was threat, I don't want that. I want the basis of that obedience being love, not
yeah.
threat.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and so this is this whole thing. This is important. This is partly why I became Orthodox, is sort
Yeah.
of working through this. And I think the Orthodox just had a bit of a better take on it, right? That I could get on. So I teach like an intro to religion and theology course at Fordham, right? And one of the texts I have them read is The Life of Moses by Gregory of Nyssa, right?
Yep.
Just an example of sort of symbolic interpretations. But at the very end of the book, I'm going to read you the short paragraph because I think you'll love it. I almost tear up every time I read it because it really gets to me. But it gets at this whole rewards and punishment thing, right?
Yep.
So I
Yep.
think you'll like this. It goes, since the goal of the virtuous way of life was the very thing we have been seeking, and this goal has been found in what we have said, it is time for you, noble friend, to look to that example and by transferring to your own life what is contemplated through spiritual interpretation of the things spoken literally, to be known by God and to become his friend.
Mhm.
This is true perfection, not to avoid a wicked life because, like slaves, we servilely fear punishment, nor to do good because we hope for rewards, as if cashing in on the virtuous life by some business-like and contractual arrangement. On the contrary, disregarding all those things for which we hope and which we have been reserved by promise, we regard falling from God's friendship as the only thing dreadful, and we consider becoming God's friend the only thing worthy of honor and desire. This is the perfect life.
Yes. Yes.
It's
Yes.
just so good,
Yes.
I just I'm like, yeah, more of that,
Well, and I think that's completely biblical. I mean, when
Yes,
you
yeah,
look
yes,
at these moments when Jesus is warning people or relating people to relate, relating the threat that they are facing, it's always in relational terms. It's depart from me, I never knew you.
Yeah.
And that then is the fear. And I think, someone like C.S. Lewis, you can see him really wrestling with those issues in something like The Great Divorce.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, and I think this is an area that probably as orthodoxy becomes a much um, more a much larger conversation partner in Christianity in America, these issues are going to come up. That there are a lot of oh gosh, there are a lot of situations in life where um, understanding what punishment is and isn't,
Mm.
especially if it's not sort of fully agentic. So one of the things, of course, that I played around with on my channel was sort of God number one and God number two. And I was playing with John Vervaeke's agent arena relationship. So God number one is sort of arenic, and God number two is sort of agentic. And there's not two gods, it's one God. And this distinction I got from, well, actually, I started working with it before that, but Ezekiel Kaufman is an early 20th century Jewish scholar who wrote a book called, I forget the name of the book, The Religion of Israel, and where he basically pulls out the difference between, let's say, the religion found in the Bible, in the Old Testament, which is very peculiar in the ancient world, because the ancient world sort of distilled pretty much every other religion sort of imagines this meta-divine realm, this impersonal meta-divine realm in which there are gods that they're functioning, and those gods sort of get, transmitted down to human level in various forms and manifestations. And the thing that he noted is that for the religion of Israel, there's no arena above God, which 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 gives sort of God this arenic quality. And so when you read, let's say, the promises and punishments are super salient in, let's say, the book of Deuteronomy, where it's almost just that stark in the book of Deuteronomy. Here is the covenant, fulfill the covenant and you will live, and life looks like all of this flourishing. Break the covenant and you will die, and life looks like all this tragedy. Um, to what degree is that agentic and arenic in
Mm.
that and I think Lewis tries to get at that in The Great Divorce, and I think as the church continues to process this conversation about lostness, perdition, and all of those issues, and how they sort of finally break down in us, and how they get, I think the church is going to continue to chew on that. And the part of the beauty of Orthodoxy is that they have this room and they open it up, and it's like, here, read this guy. How about him? How about him? And you can find, you've got some who will, you've got a portion just like that from Gregory of Nyssa. And then you've got others who are just breathing fire and
Yeah. Yeah.
damnation out there, and they're both there, and so they both sit in front of us, and now it's like, okay, we've got both of these. What are we going to do with this? How are we going to process this? And especially when you're working in a local church with individual people, all who have particular and unique backgrounds, and they come to you in a moment in time, and it's okay, how do I apply all of this to you now? Which
Yeah.
which to me
Yeah.
is just the
Yeah, I know. And it is. And in the Orthodox tradition, sort of with the heavy emphasis on the priest as spiritual, like the whole like spiritual father aspect, which is really heavy there. That's where I mean, that's sort of where the rubber meets the road of like, all this theology, like, will all this work to get this person to a better place? And it's like, do I need to be more lenient with this person, more gentle? Do I need to be more harsh and draw a line? Right? It reminds me of a story that I didn't hear this. My wife did, for my youngest son, who's 10. and overheard him talking to his other friends. He goes, "Oh, like George's dad is a real dad." And she goes, "What does that mean?" And he goes, "Oh, he's scary and yells." Right? And all the boys are sort of like, yes, there's a degree to which it was like even little boys, even though they're sort of like they don't like to get in trouble, they don't like to get yelled at. There's a sense of like if you're too nice as a dad, you're not a real dad. Like there's a lack of respect. Like you have to be sort of like Aslan, good but scary, right?
Hmm.
Um, so there's something there, I think, instinctually of like a balance between God's harshness and his gentleness. And that balance has to be worked out with our understanding of, say, like eschatological issues like hell or even punishment in this own life. This has to be worked out because just rushing to one side or the other, right? Either it's like hellfire and brimstone or sort of some sort of like super, I don't know, like um, Mr. Rogers neighborhood type God,
Right.
right? Nothing against Mr. Rogers. I really love and respect him, but like, like, but that kind of an image, like, I don't think either of those are going to work. Um,
The Jonathan Edwards, I got this from Tim Keller. Jonathan Edwards talked about these diverse excellencies and how the amazing thing about Jesus is that he's both more demanding than we think is reasonable
mhm.
and more forgiving than we think is responsible.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It really is. See, that's what every time this is why even when people lose faith in the church, people often won't lose faith in some connection with Jesus because Jesus as a person is just compelling,
Yes,
right?
yes.
You run into it and you're like, who even is this? Right? Like he breaks all frames, right? Constantly. Yeah, and so
Well, and I think,
that's why I love
part of
Christianity.
what's
But
interesting right now in terms of, I mean, I have, even as a Protestant, sort of a front row seat of a little bit of sort of this Orthodox wave that's happening in America. And what's so interesting is that, see, part of my thinking about Jesus is we as individuals, I can't manage that diverse excellency that Jesus can because I'm not Jesus. And as much as, the Holy Spirit's working in me and I'm, trying to grow up and be like Jesus, et cetera, et cetera, I don't got the range of Jesus. And let's say somebody who's just mean on one hand and then dismissive on the other hand, they're not compelling at all. They're just, but Jesus manages to do it with integrity where you actually see the range. But then when you think about Christ as the church as the body of Christ, you see that range in the church, but
yeah, yeah.
but then
That's
the
the right
church,
that's the right way to think about it.
yeah,
That's the right way to think about it, right? Is that it's like together the whole church makes up the icon of Christ, right?
yep,
It's
yep,
just like this, like the image of God. The image of God isn't this is something Orthodox theologian Sergei Bulgakov sort of pushes at in one of his books called the Bride of the or no, the Lamb of God. And it's that the image of God is only fully sort of realized in a human person when the male and female are brought together, right? It's that male and female together constitute the image of God.
yep,
So in some sense, like my gender, right, is like as a male is like it's incomplete, right?
yep,
In terms of the image of God, right? And even other church fathers like Maximus get into this, and they're just like, this is why all the divisions in the Genesis story, where God's constantly dividing things to create identity, the identities and divisions are then brought back into harmony and in some
yep.
sort of unity that is unity without compromising the integrity of identity, right? And so it's a very similar idea, right?
And that's why although it's frustrating and can be kind of chaotic and sometimes even destructive, I look at both of these sort of it's not just in the Orthodox Church, Protestant churches too. I mean, all this stuff just gets manifested out there. You have sort of the Universalist wing out there, and people are, but these people are worried. Then you have the hardliners over here, and what's so interesting in this Orthodox moment is that on one hand, sort of you have the Ortho bros that are all we're masculine, we're hardline, we're, take no prisoners. Boy, if you're not fasting from just about everything conceivable fastable during Lent, I've got no place in you. And then you've got the other Orthodox that are over on the other side, and they're like, they're they're reading Bulgakov, and they're Universalist, and they're, just enjoying
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
everything.
Yeah. But and it's nice to be able to have a tradition that's um able to hold together some amount of diversity, partly just because people are so different. Like in my parish, like I guess we'd be considered more conservative for New York, for Manhattan, but I mean that's not saying much for the rest of the country. But there's a good amount. I mean, there's a good amount of political diversity. I have people who are on like very, very wide ends of the spectrum. But I think that's sort of a litmus test for a community. Like, can you have that kind of sort of political or cultural diversity and still like hold your unity and your love
Yes,
together?
yes,
That's a great
yes.
test. And part of like that's the trial of salvation and loving each other. It's like you got
Yeah.
to figure out how to do that, right?
Well, and not
But
just
you're
and
not
not
allowed to
just
fail at it.
and not just say nice things about each other, but still be a cohesive thing.
Yes.
We are okay. We have diversity in this church, political diversity and diversity on a number of other things, but people can still see us and say they're a church, they're a body. There's a union there, and that union is meaningful and powerful and compelling, and something that not only people outside but even people inside continue to aspire to embody and to create amongst themselves. And
Yeah.
I think that's part of the challenge of it's always part of the challenge of sort of the big C church, where we're all sort of claiming Jesus and praying that Jesus is claiming us. And but that's always sort of how we're trying to embody Christ now as his body in this place, in this time, in this culture, with all of those particularities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
So anyways, it's going to be like a challenge for us is with all these, like, you talked about all these younger people coming in.
yeah,
This wave of converts is a good bit different from what I experienced and what like my cohort went through. I mean, Orthodoxy has had a series of like waves of converts, like waves of immigration since like the mid 70s, right? Or early 70s, which is kind of when English started being used. Like if you went to Orthodox Church in the 1960s, like there would be nothing in English anywhere, right? There was like one book written by Timothy Ware, right? In 1970. So it's been a pretty radical transformation, like in the US, Orthodoxy's gone through over the past 50 years. Um, and so this wave is very different. It's a very unchurched wave. And so it's great to have like 12, 15 catechumens, right? Like we do in our parish, but that's a ton more work for me to sort of form people. Like I talked a little bit with this about at ARC, like a couple of my rules, like I make people they have to be a catechumen for a year. They have to basically show that they can stick around and that they really want to do this. Um, People have to actually demonstrate that they're involved and engaged. They have to actually belong to the community, right? And so
yeah,
there's something belonging actually will precede the conversion,
yes,
right? So and this stuff just takes a lot of work. And you have people who they don't have. There's all these things, you and I growing up like take for granted growing up in very religious households and religious communities. A lot of people have none of this, and so there's a lot of you're like pouring foundations for people. Uh, and so it's exciting and fun and challenging, but it's a lot of work too. And there's a lot of risk that it won't be done right, right? In the same way, like I have an old house. Our house is like 120 years old. So whenever we fix something, we just expect that there's going to be more to fix. Like you pull out, like, oh, look at this wiring job. House hasn't burned down yet. Thank God, right? And so you run into that stuff. But see, that's what's going to happen to us if we don't do a good job with this, because it's happening at a scale and a pace that is actually very challenging to keep up with,
yeah, yeah.
right? And so it's yeah, there's just a high risk for sort of for miscarriage.